This is Season 1, Episode 14, and you are listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that the truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we've created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook readings of stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kind of discussions we hope you're having about these readings with friends, family, or students. We would love it if you would go over and check it out. In fact, we discuss the ethics and discussions made in this very story in our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, in episode 45. So when you're all done listening to this audio podcast, head over to our companion podcast and listen to our discussion of this story. We'll include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage in the comments section or on our Facebook page. I'm Colby, your narrator and the creator of After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/After Dinner Conversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to your friends. Today's story is in the March 2021 magazine, and it is entitled Bill and the Tooth Fairy by Carl Tait. Bill believed in the Tooth Fairy. Big deal, you're thinking. Lots of kids believe in the Tooth Fairy. Well, Bill wasn't a kid. He was 28 years old. You don't believe it? My girlfriend Mary Beth didn't believe it either. We were having dinner with Bill and his friend Carolee. I guess I should say that Carolee was Bill's girlfriend, but I can't quite make myself do that. Carolee was a friendly soul who went places with Bill and tried to make him seem a little less strange than he would have been otherwise. She felt some genuine affection for Bill, but to hear her tell it, she was mainly doing her Christian duty in helping one of God's odder children feel more comfortable in a world that didn't seem to fit him very well. We were having a good dinner time talk when Bill suddenly brought up the Tooth Fairy. But let's not talk about that, Carolee said with an uncharacteristic note of strain in her voice. Why not? Asked Bill. Roy and Mary Beth don't mind. It's fine with me, I said. Not what I expected to be discussing this evening, but that's okay. Bill smiled. No bad time to talk about the Tooth Fairy, right? Well, maybe not when you're at the dentist getting a tooth filled, answered Mary Beth. Bill laughed too loudly. Carolee had tried to coach him on that, but Bill was still prone to ruckus laughter over little ha-ha lines that would barely even earn a chuckle from most of us. You're right, Mary Beth. Even the Tooth Fairy herself wouldn't think you should talk about her while you're getting one of your precious molars repaired. Carolee smiled thinly. And speaking of unpleasant things, I ran into the worst traffic on 285 this morning. Some joker was... Bill cut her off. Now, Carolee, we weren't done talking about the Tooth Fairy. You know, she doesn't like it when you disrespect her like that. Wait, I'm lost, said Mary Beth. Who doesn't like what? Bill smiled at Mary Beth patiently. The Tooth Fairy gets real unhappy when you don't treat her with respect, like jumping from a good talk about the dentist into some boring story about a traffic jam. Carolee's face went red, but she stayed quiet. She realized the crazy cow had escaped from the barn, and there was nothing to do but wait for it to tire itself out. Mary Beth was still struggling to build a fence around the subject with common sense. She forced a laugh. Well, I haven't thought much about the Tooth Fairy since I was 9 years old, so I imagine She stopped caring about me at this point. Oh no, Bill answered with concern. She cares about you even more now. She already has all of your baby teeth, but she watches you every day. She's waiting for you to have children and tell them all about her and make sure they leave their teeth for her. Mary Beth tried to say something else but failed. I cleared my throat and stepped in gently. Bill, are you saying that you still believe in the tooth fairy? Bill looked at me with horror. Of course I do, don't you? Carly told me that some people don't believe in the tooth fairy, but I thought she was joking. Mary Beth had recovered her ability to speak. Bill, what do people usually say when you mention the tooth fairy? Well, I don't talk about her that often, since we all know that talking about her too much is just as bad as too little. But when I do mention her, people always smile and laugh. Everyone loves her. But not everyone believes in her, I said. In fact, I've never met an adult who did. Bill's obese body trembled with agitation. That's not true. That can't be true. How about God? Don't you believe in God? Sure, I lied. Actually, I hadn't believed in God or any other deities for a long time, but I'd not found this advisable to announce in the middle of a casual conversation, even in modern-day Atlanta. But you can't see God, so why don't you believe in him? I paused. Bill, let's not get into a religious discussion. Those are for church and for your private thoughts. I just need to know for sure. You honestly believe that the tooth fairy is real? Bill's round face was as darkly angry as I'd ever seen it. Of course I do. Of course I do. Carolee touched Bill's arm gently. Honey, let's not talk about this anymore right now. Some people don't like to discuss the tooth fairy in public. We all know how mad she can get about that. Carolee looked at Mary Beth and me with something approaching desperation. There was silence for a moment. Bill was calming down. I shifted in my seat. So, Carolee, what in the heck happened on the 285 this morning? Carolee came by my desk the next day at work. We both worked at McPhee's, but she worked in the other building, so it wasn't so easy for her to come over during the day. I guessed it must be pretty important, and I was betting it was about the tooth fairy. I was right on both points. Roy, can I talk to you about last night? She said quietly. Miss Billingham at the next desk overheard and looked up with surprise. Carolee shot her a look, and Miss Billingham turned back to her work. Sure, I said. That conference room is free. Let's talk in there. Carolee nodded, and we walked to the room, aware that Miss Billingham had lifted her head again and was watching us. I closed the door. Tell me about it. Carolee drew a shuddering breath. As you know, Bill is a little bit unusual. Yeah, I've known that since elementary school, I answered. Bill was always the strange one, even back in 5th grade. But he's a decent and well-meaning guy, and I'm glad the two of you have been spending time together. Carolee's forced smile suggested that her own happiness with the situation was less than wholehearted. This tooth fairy thing, you have to understand, it's just a little quirk of his. He'd sometimes mention it when we were kids, but I didn't think anything about it then. He really still believes it? I was hoping to learn that the previous evening was an elaborate joke. He really believes it, she answered. It doesn't usually interfere with real life. I mean, how often do adults talk about the tooth fairy, especially adults without kids? Not very often, I guess. But when the subject comes up, wow, Bill is going to get some interesting conversations rolling. How do people usually react? They think he's joking, Carolee answered. And he thinks they're joking if they say the tooth fairy doesn't exist. In his mind, it's common knowledge that she's real. You got him worked up last night and ran him off the rails, but he's back to normal today, or as normal as he gets. So why does he believe such a strange thing? You have to remember he was an orphan, Carolee said. His parents were killed in a plane crash when he was only 8. He was brought up in an orphanage by some very kind people, but somehow no one got around to telling him that the tooth fairy wasn't real. Wait, I don't understand, I said. When he lost a tooth, he put it under the pillow at the orphanage? They couldn't have given him money every single time along with all the other kids. You've still got a lot of teeth to lose when you're 8. Carolee shrugged. Lord, I don't know. All I know is what he tells me, and he tells me a lot of tooth fairy gobbledygook. I have to listen to way more of it than anyone else, and it's gotten worse in the past few months. She came to a halt, but clearly had more to say. I waited. I should tell you something else, Carolee finally continued. He'd never had his wisdom teeth taken out, and they started causing him problems a few months ago. Most people would have thought that was pretty darn annoying, but not Bill. I've never seen him so happy. He was going to have more teeth for his beloved tooth fairy. That's the first time it was clear to me that he really believed it all. Bill told the tooth surgeon to save all of his wisdom teeth after he took them out. The doctor asked why. The tooth fairy, of course, Bill answered. The doctor laughed politely and decided it wasn't worth arguing about. He saved the teeth, but one of them was pretty busted up by the time he got it out. He threw it away without asking Bill, just gave him a little package of the other 3 teeth and told him to open it later. That night, Bill opened the packet with such excitement, and then he started sobbing. Only 3, only 3. What has he done? What will she do? I didn't have to ask who she was. Neither do I, interjected. Carolee's face was sad. He was so upset. I tried to tell him the tooth fairy would be happy to see more of his teeth and she wouldn't mind that one was missing. It was hard to calm him down, but the pain medicine finally helped him sleep, with those 3 stupid teeth under his pillow. So when he woke up in the morning and the teeth were still there, what did he do? Carolee looked uncomfortable and said nothing. No, wait, you didn't, I asked with disbelief. Yes, I'm afraid I did, Carolee answered. He had a hard time with the surgery and was so unhappy about the last tooth, and I just wanted to make him feel better. So I took those 3 hideous teeth and put them in the garbage outside. Then I left some money under the pillow. Did it occur to you that shoring up his belief in a childhood fantasy might not be the best course of action? It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. He was so happy when he woke up and found his teeth gone and the money in its place. He was like a little kid again. If he's ever been anything else. Mary Beth and I talked about the tooth fairy over dinner that night. I wanted to leave Bill alone to enjoy his supernatural dental friend. Mary Beth, however, was more concerned. At the least, she wanted to understand how his odd belief had managed to survive his growth out of childhood in the orphanage. I knew Gilhall Orphanage pretty well. My mama had been friends with a few people who worked there. So the next morning, we called the orphanage and made an appointment to visit later in the day. It was Saturday, but there were always staff members on duty. Gilden Hall was an imposing but not unfriendly building. We walked up the well-worn marble steps and made our way through the aging front doors. A woman at the front desk looked up with a smile. May I help you? Yes, we have an appointment to see Sylvia Banksby. My name is Roy Hartsdale. Oh, Mr. Hartsdale, yes. This way, please. Sylvia Banksby's office was a little ways down the hall. She stood as we entered and offered a broad smile. Little Roy. Not so little anymore, I see. You look more like your mama all the time. I introduced Mary Beth while Sylvia looked in vain for a wedding ring and tried to conceal her disappointment. So what brings you here, Roy? Asked Sylvia. It's about an old friend of mine, Bill Husterut. We've known each other since we were kids, and I know he grew up in this orphanage. Sylvia's face softened. Bill, yes, I remember him well. You know, I can't tell you anything confidential, but I can talk in general. Let me get right to it. We just learned that he still believes in the tooth fairy. Sylvia grew slightly pale. Still? How could he have grown up without finding out the truth? Asked Mary Beth, with a slightly sharper edge than was advisable. Sylvia flinched, but answered steadily. That's a reasonable question, young lady. The circumstances were highly unusual. As you know, as everyone knows, Bill came to live with us after his parents were killed. He was a fragile boy who had been deeply hurt. He latched on to the one thing he understood at that point, a loose tooth. Mary Beth raised her eyebrows. Sylvia looked irritated. Yes, a loose tooth. No matter how silly you find the idea, he lost that tooth the first week he was here and told us he was putting it under his pillow. His parents might have left him, but he was sure the tooth fairy wouldn't abandon him. I couldn't stand to add to his losses, so I took his tooth and left him a little money. He cried with happiness the next morning. I told him he had to keep it a secret because the tooth fairy didn't like it when kids bragged about the money they got. Actually, I didn't want word getting around the orphanage that anyone was going to get money for their teeth because we didn't usually do that. What about the teeth he lost over the next years? I asked, already suspecting the answer. There didn't seem to be a good time to stop playing Tooth Fairy, Sylvia explained. He'd get so happy and excited when he was about to lose a tooth. One of us would always make sure the tooth vanished and money appeared. It didn't need to be much. Bill wasn't demanding. He was just so charmed by the idea that someone magical was watching over him. Mary Beth and I glanced at each other. Then his last baby tooth came out, Sylvia continued. He was so sad about it. He said that even though he'd never seen the tooth fairy, he felt her presence and didn't know what he'd do without her. So I decided to make his last tooth a special one. I went to a costume shop and bought some fairy wings and a little gold crown. After Bill was asleep, I put on my costume and went into his room. He slept like a big, fat bear in winter, so I had no trouble swapping that final tooth under his pillow for money. This time, though, I wanted him to wake up a little bit as I was leaving. So as I walked out, I made a skittery shuffling sound with my feet, just like I imagined a fairy would do as she was flying away after a good deed. I tried to imagine this plump older woman wearing fairy wings and a crown while shuffling her feet like a cheerful sprite, but was not successful. Sylvia was smiling at the memory. I heard him stir in the bed behind me, then I heard a little gasp. I knew he'd caught a glimpse of my wings and crown from the back, and that was exactly what I'd wanted. Her smile faded. But now I'm not so sure. Are you certain he still believes in the tooth fairy? We thanked Sylvia and left her to contemplate her actions. We drove home and everything was normal until the next morning, when the phone started ringing at an hour that was way too early for us. I fumbled my way out of bed and grabbed the phone. Hello? Roy, is that you? Carolee, what's up? You sound frantic. I am, Lord Almighty, I really am. I came over to pick up Bill from church and, well, it's awfully hard to explain. Let me put Bill on the line. I heard her pass the phone. Hi, Roy, it's Bill. His voice was tired and defeated. Bill, what's the matter? She's deserted me, Roy. She's gone. Carolee is right there with you. I just talked to her. Not Carolee, the tooth fairy. I closed my eyes. What makes you think that? Bill sighed. Carolee says she told you about my wisdom teeth. That's okay, it wasn't a secret. But that whole thing with the missing tooth has been bothering me ever since. So I finally decided that I owed the tooth fairy something else to make up for it. Do you remember the dental plate my Uncle Doug used to wear? As it happened, I did. Bill's drunkard of an uncle had lost a couple of teeth in a bar fight and had worn a dental appliance to fill in the gaps. No implants back in those days. Uncle Doug liked to do a magic trick for us kids. He'd smile broadly, then turn away and pull out his dental plate, then turn back to face us with a huge grin. Kids would scream when they saw the missing teeth. Bill loved it. When Uncle Doug died a couple of years ago, Bill asked if he could keep the dental plate. He was Doug's only living relative, so he got the treasure. Not that anyone else would have ever wanted it. Yes, I remember that. What about it? I asked. Well, the teeth on the dental plate were my Uncle Doug's teeth, not his God-given teeth, because Juquith Hildebrand took those away when he punched him in the mouth. But pretty close. It wasn't like they were a whole set of false teeth. I smelled where this was going, and I didn't like it. May Uncle Doug's spirit forgive me, but I pried those teeth off the dental plate and put them under my pillow. I even wrote a note to the tooth fairy explaining what I was doing so she wouldn't think I was trying to trick her. I put everything under my pillow last night, and when I woke up this morning, they were still there." His voice broke. I wanted to comfort Bill, but I didn't want to lie to him. "What do you think that means?" I asked. "It means she's abandoned me," Bill cried. "What else could it mean? She was so insulted by the fake teeth that she didn't even bother taking them or leaving me an answer. I've made her angry and she's gone, probably forever." He began to cry. "I can't talk anymore, Roy. Here's Carolee." I heard the phone changing hands. "Hold on, Roy," said Carolee. She moved the phone away from her mouth, but I could still hear what she was saying. "Bill, you need to lie down for a while. Give your body and your mind a little time to rest. You can skip church today." She waited for Bill to leave the room, then put the phone back to her mouth. "Roy, I'm really worried about Bill. He's gotten stranger and stranger since that thing with his wisdom teeth. I've never seen him as bad as he is today. He's convinced that the tooth fairy has turned her back on him, and he just can't stand that. I don't know how to help him." "You might try telling him the truth." "No, Roy, not today. He couldn't take it. First, his special friend deserts him. Then he finds out that she never existed in the first place. It would only make things worse." "I'm not sure what to say then. Can you spend some time with him?" "Mary Beth and I already have plans for the day." "This afternoon I have to drive down to Macomb to see my Aunt Minnie. I won't be back until tomorrow. Could you give Bill a call this evening to make sure that he's doing okay?" "Sure. I'll be glad to check on him. If you have time, you might even stop by. If he doesn't answer the doorbell, the key is under the mat." "You're kidding." "Why would I be kidding?" asked Carolee. "Doesn't everyone do that?" Mary Beth and I enjoyed our Sunday and stayed out past dark. When we got home, I picked up the phone and called Bill. I hadn't forgotten my promise to check in on him, but I wasn't looking forward to the conversation. There was no answer. I tried again 5 minutes later and let it ring 10 times. Still nothing. I hung up and turned to Mary Beth. "I think I better go check on Bill. He was in bad shape this morning, and now he's not answering the phone. He lives only 15 minutes away. I won't be long." Mary Beth shook her head sadly. "Poor old Bill. Hope he's all right, or at least better than this morning." I drove as quickly as I could. When I arrived at Bill's, the lights were out. I went to the door and knocked, not really expecting an answer. I didn't get one. I flipped over the doormat and, sure enough, there was a shiny key underneath. I wouldn't normally go into someone else's house uninvited, but the circumstances were unusual. I pushed the bright key into the lock, and it did its job without complaint. The door opened easily. I stepped into the dim living room, where Bill's cheap furniture was arranged with geometric precision. The house appeared to be deserted. "Bill," I called. No answer. I had almost convinced myself I should leave when I heard a faint wheezing sound. It was coming from down the hall. Pushing aside thoughts of horror movies and lurking murderers, I walked quickly down the hall towards the sound. It turned out to be coming from Bill's bedroom. The door was partway open and I stepped inside. I will never forget what I saw, though I wish I could. Bill was lying in bed, moonlight bathing his face. The area around his mouth was thick with blood, and the white pillow under his head was red and wet. His face was deadly pale, and I thought he was dead. Then that awful face opened its eyes and turned to look at me. "Roy," wheezed Bill, "what are you doing here?" Blood ran out of his mouth and onto the sheets. "Jesus Christ, Bill, what happened?" "You shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain. That's what Carolee says. She's so nice. But she doesn't understand the tooth fairy." I swallowed hard. "You're saying the tooth fairy did this to you?" Bill laughed as best he could. It made him cough, and his blood spattered the floor. No, of course not. She'd never do anything like this. I did it to please her. Look." He opened his mouth, and I saw that at least a dozen teeth were missing. I gagged, but my dinner stayed inside me. Bill slowly lifted his right arm from under the sheet. In his hand he was holding a pair of pliers that were encrusted with blood. The tooth fairy hated Uncle Doug's fake teeth. I understood that, but it took me a while to figure out that I had to give her real teeth to make her love me again. I owed her a wisdom tooth, and that's a big and important one, so I planned to give her as many regular teeth as I could. I took a bunch of aspirin and set to work, but it hurt a lot and I started feeling woozy, so I lay down. Bill, I need to call an ambulance. You're in bad shape. No, said Bill with more force than he had managed so far. I did a good job, look. He lifted the edge of his pillow. Underneath was a gory mess of teeth and blood. Some of the teeth were broken, and the insane thought crossed my mind that the tooth fairy wouldn't like that. His energy used up, Bill let his arm fall to the bed and turned his face back to the ceiling. Look, he cried. Look, Roy, look. I saw nothing. It's her. She's coming to get my teeth. I see her wings and her little golden crown. Bill started grinning and crying. Tears ran from the corners of his eyes down to his pillow, mingling with his blood. I knew I should call an ambulance, but found myself unable to move. It didn't matter. Bill smiled beatifically at the empty air over his bed. His eyes went glassy as his smile slackened, not in disbelief, but in death. Discussion questions. Number 1. How is Bill's belief in the tooth fairy different than a sincere belief in God? For example, Bill has the money under his pillow and saw the tooth fairy. Arguably, he has proof for his faith. Number 2. At what point, if any, should the various characters, Roy, Carolee, Sylvia, Mary Beth, have made it clear to Bill the tooth fairy was not real? Why is their obligation different than that regarding any other belief made on faith? Number 3. At exactly what point, if any, did Bill's belief in the tooth fairy go from harmless to unhealthy? How do you determine which sincerely held incorrect beliefs are harmful? Number 4. Is Carolee leaving Bill over his belief in the tooth fairy appropriate? Should she have left right when he made clear this was a sincere belief earlier in the relationship? Number 5. How much responsibility does Sylvia or Carolee have in Bill's death, given that they each provided him evidence of the tooth fairy by taking teeth out from under his pillow? How is what they did different than what parents do? The end. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, episode 45, and listen to our discussion of this and other short stories from our magazine. We'll include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage, in the comments section, or on our Facebook page. Thank you once again for joining us. Have a great day. And tune in next week. We'll be discussing yet another story, Sienna's Monster by Misty Van Dan. Bye.